And welcome into Press Box Live. I'm Stan the Fan Charles of Press Box. And tonight we're going to remember Mel Antonen. And tonight, specifically on this Zoom, we're going to talk about Mel, the TV performer. And to do that, we've got Glenn Clark with us. Glenn, thank you for coming in for Gary Stein tonight. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, Stan. This is great.
I want to remind everybody that Press Box Live is brought to you by C3 American Exteriors. Go to their website at c3america.com to get a brand new roof for just the cost of your insurance deductible. So joining us, I know you recognize Rob Long, of course, of 105.7 The Fan. And I guess we can say, you're still doing some stuff with MASN and the Baltimore Orioles. Yes. Dave Johnson is with us, former Baltimore Oriole pitcher and longtime co-host or panelist on the Mid-Atlantic Sports Report. Alex Parker is with us. Alex was a host on that program as well. And then the two guys you might not readily recognize are Eric Delinski, who is the executive producer of the Mid-Atlantic Sports Report. Is that too lofty a title, Eric?
Maybe a little too lofty.
All right, he was the producer.
I'll take it.
Just the producer. And Joe, that means I can only call you the associate producer.
I guess that's all you can call me, yeah.
So I used to watch the Mid-Atlantic Sports Report.
Stan, can I step in? They're the crack staff. They're the crack staff.
The crack staff. That is
just
true.
wrap them all up into one thing. That's the crack staff.
That is true. That is true. I used to watch the Mid-Atlantic Sports Report for, I guess, what year did it start, Eric? Did it start like 2009, 10?
2011.
11. Okay. Watched it all the time. Only dreamed of being on it and got to be on it like its last 18 months on the air.
Yeah, Stan killed it. He killed the show.
I've had to
thank him.
Thanks, Stan.
But Mel Antonen he wasn't the classic TV performer, was he, Eric?
No, not at all. He everybody knows Mel's personality. He took some coaching, but as we all know, I'm sure we'll share some stories, but there were some good days and some bad days with Mel, but we all got laughs out of it. So that's all that matters.
Well, I know we're going to be laughing during these 25 minutes, and nobody had a better relationship with Mel than Dave Johnson. They had such a great chemistry on the air. It must be, I know we're going to laugh tonight, but Dave, I know you're hurting inside.
Yeah, this was, this is still tough to take because it's even more of an unusual situation simply because we haven't worked together for a year because Mel went on vacation with his family. He got back. He got sick right away. I was away a little bit in February and March myself, going to some vacation myself. So, and then COVID hit mid-March, so we didn't work together. So we were trying to keep track of what was going on with Mel. And the distance between us and the time of not actually being together on set 5 days a week and interacting is really tough. It's still kind of hard for me to believe that Mel is not with us anymore. Even though, some of us had talked to him on somewhat of a regular basis. If we didn't talk to him and text him, then we were, getting information from Dan Conley and Joe Papparotto, and Aaron Eric, who were, talking to him on somewhat regular basis if Mel was up to it. So it's a really kind of a strange situation here that even though I think a lot of us kind of felt that this may be inevitable, I go back to, I had a conversation with Dan Conley, who talked to Mel last Friday, and he was like, hey, Mel's getting out of the hospital. He's doing better. He was really chirpy on the phone. And I'm like, wow, really? That's great news. And less than 48 hours later, he's gone. So yeah, and Mel and I just, again, we'll have time to talk, but Mel sat, our desks were next to each other, and then clearly we sat next to each other during the show. Every day we were together, and he was just he was a lot of fun to be around. He had a great sense of humor. He absolutely, unlike some people that we know, he could actually take a ribbing and hand one out. And that made it fun when you have to work and do things, day in and day out. Mel was absolutely terrific in that regard. It was absolutely hilarious.
Hey,
We just
before I turn it over to Glenn to ask a couple of questions to Rob and Alex, Dave brings up something that's very interesting, is the thing that we were all pretty close to Mel because we worked with him all the time. And then all of a sudden with the pandemic, none of us have worked with him. We never got back in to do shows with him.
No, we never got back in to do shows with him, but I had the privilege of having him on the Big Bad Morning Show a couple of times. In fact, we had him on there last week, and the segment was a little shorter than normal because Mel didn't sound 100%. And when we let him go, we explained to the audience, I talked to Mel about the Hall of Fame vote, and he didn't sound 100% when I talked to him. And I asked him, I said, you sure you want to do this? And he said, yeah, let me do this. Please let me do this.
Yeah. And
we got him on, and he didn't sound 100%, but we let it roll for a little while. And I'll be honest with you, Stan, I asked the station to send me a copy of that because I wanted it. I wanted to keep that because that's his last interview.
That's the last thing he ever did.
And I'm with Dave. It's hard for me to believe Mel's not here because I stayed in contact with him via text. And, those are texts that I probably never want to erase. Mel, to me, was the funny and most genuine guy that I've ever met in this business. I still remember the Donut Fridays and him busting my chops about my horrible selection of donuts to the point where he took credit for buying the donuts. I mean, Mel was almost a walking caricature of himself. I never met someone who made fun of himself more than Mel without making himself look like clownish. I mean, he made you take him serious because he didn't take himself serious. And at the same time, at times I wanted to look at him and say, don't you know you're legendary? I mean, because he is literally legendary. And Dave eloquently pointed that out. And Dave doesn't do a lot of things eloquently, but he eloquently pointed that out when he was on our show earlier this week, that Mel knew everybody, and Mel was
the walking Rolodex,
honored by everybody. Everybody loved him. Rachel Nichols did basically saluted him in a tweet this week as well. I mean, it was almost like he didn't realize what he meant to the baseball world, but everybody else around him did. And to me, I consider myself having worked with, a baseball giant, working with him over the years. Some of the most fun I've ever had working at all was working with Mel and Dave. Honestly, it was some of the most fun I've ever had. I felt guilty calling that work because we just had so much fun busting one another's chops for 90 minutes. It was the most unorthodox live television show ever, in my opinion.
Parker, how about that aspect of the fact that he was close to us, but we'd been separated for so many months?
And I, for one, was not good about reaching out and keeping in touch. It just so happens, and I'm sort of blessed and thankful that something made me about 2 weeks ago call him on my way to work, and I called him, left him a voicemail, and about 4 or 5 days later he called back, and I was thrilled, and he sounded pretty good, although he sort of detailed to me, as I'm sure he did many of you via text, or maybe if you talked to him on the phone, what he was going through. And it was horrific and confusing and very involved. And as he described it, he says to me, as only Mel could say, I need a 6-4-3, meaning he needed a double play to get out of this thing. And I said, I hope it's tailor-made. And he kind of chuckled, and he did that Mel thing where it's sort of funny, it's sort of serious. You're not sure if he's kidding. You're not sure if he's dead serious. He's just sort of Mel, and there was a sort of mystery to a degree to Mel Antonen. As much as we knew him, he kind of was sometimes a tough nut to crack. But I was struck by and thinking about him over the last few days. I know Rob talked about how he didn't take himself seriously. What he took so seriously was baseball. obviously. And I think all of us are fans. And I think there's a bunch of wonderful writers out there that love the game. I think for Mel Antonen, the game was more than that. If it can be more than love, for Mel it was. I've been thinking about him. It was almost like he was like a steward of the game. I think he took his job and his place in the sport, his place amongst other media, incredibly seriously. And but without being cocky. He didn't know how big he was, as Rob just pointed out.
Yeah.
He didn't know just how much everybody thought so highly of him, but he really loved baseball. And I think it was so in him to be a steward of the game and to help the game be as good as it can be, which I think is different than a lot of us, which is, oh man, we love baseball. We're going to consume it. We're going to talk about it. We just love it. I think for Mel, it was more than that. I think it was a deeper level for Mel Antonen, and it showed in his work and what everybody's saying about him now.
Glenn, I know you got a couple questions for this.
Yeah,
group.
I want to go to Eric and Joe for a second because, Mel was such, as these guys have pointed out, he was such a significant figure as a baseball writer. And here he makes this transition into TV and obviously radio as well with Sirius XM. What allowed that? There's guys that just can't do this. There's guys that they're writers.
That's a
That's
great
what they
point.
are.
That's a great point.
Eric, can you start with what allowed for it to happen that for a generation of baseball fans, they probably knew Mel as well as being a TV guy and a radio guy as they did as being one of the most important baseball writers of decades.
And that is a good point. There were a couple times where we would need short VO scripts or something, and Mel would be like, "I'll write them," and he would turn it in, and it'd be this 3-page script of something, just like he'd be writing a story. So we had to kind of work with him, and Joe can speak to this. We kind of had to. He kind of figured it out himself. We kind of showed him a couple things, and progressively it kind of got better. There wasn't really a thing where we had to teach him. He would always, after the show, he would always come up to me and say, "Hey, did this look okay? Did that look okay?" And he would be like, "Tell me the truth." And some days we would be like, "No, Mel, you looked at the wrong camera for the first 30 minutes."
How come you never told me that over the 18 months I worked over there?
Because you couldn't hear us.
But no, that's the thing too. And Rob pointed out, everybody knew Mel. So for me, that was a lifeline too. He was a walking Rolodex. If I needed somebody for a guest, he'd be like, "Well, here's 10 people," and he would either call them or give them to me. So that helped out tremendously too, where we may be a little lost without him right now too, with guests in the show. If I would email somebody, they'd be like, "Who is this kid?" If Mel emails them, they're like, "Oh, it's Mel Antonen."
Great point. Great point.
But Joe, you can speak a little more to that also, since we both work closely with him. So go ahead.
Yeah, he definitely wanted to become a better on-air personality. He definitely did all of his homework, which that's usually the first thing that I think about with Mel. Like, he knows everyone. He wants to do a good job. He got in there so super early every day and did his research, did his work. And it wasn't until an hour and a half that after he sat down, that he was finally like, "So how you guys doing?" He was just, he wanted to get in and just get right to work. And he wanted to make the show better. And with the winter meetings, when I would go with him the last 2 years, he wanted to make sure that we got this person and this person and this person, and even setting his sights high for let's get Joe Torre, let's get this guy. And I'm like, "Mel, you think we could get them?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll just text him." I'm like, what? But he wanted the show to be better by getting these people and having great content, and the background of him being a journalist throughout the years, and his personality, just anybody would stop what they're doing to do that, to do whatever they're doing for Mel. And so that helped us all out a lot.
Mel loved to set the scene where he was at too, Joe. He would always tell you what hotel he was at.
I'm here at Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, and yeah, he loved to, and he wanted to really work on that craft. And he might not have cared too much about his mad scientist appearance, with his hair being in disarray and his glasses maybe a little off, and his coughing, but that was Mel. And that's sort of just that was just what we said. It's just Mel. And I think that's the best part about it, is it's just Mel.
Dave, I didn't get to know his family at all, but I know how special his wife Lisa and his son Emmett were to him. And his son is only 14 or 15 years old, I believe. Can you speak to that? How important Emmett was to him?
Yeah, and I only met Lisa once. So, it was such a big distance for Mel, where he lived in DC.
Yep.
So he did, Lisa didn't come up every now and then, my wife and everybody's significant other every now and then, being only 20 minutes away or so from the studio, would stop in. We're going to go somewhere after the show or before or whatever. So we kind of interacted with everybody's kind of significant other to some extent, but not necessarily with Mel, because he did live so far away. And Emmett was young, over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. Emmett went from, 5, 6, 7 years old to where he is now. And I actually hadn't seen Emmett I was like, he was 14. I was like, I thought Emmett was like 10. So it has actually been a while since I saw Emmett in the studio. But yeah, and we would always chat because of my relationship with Mel, being there every day, talking baseball. And then with, of course, my son Steve coming up with the Orioles 8, 9 years ago. And then him having a son, and big baseball guy, as we all know. So he was always interested in how did that kind of happen with Steve. And then he talked to me about wanting to get Emmett up to my house, where I had a facility. And then even when I talked to him more recently, where Steve was doing training at my house before he opened up his facility a couple months back in Bel Air, how we wanted to get Emmett up. And he's like, I'll pay him. I'm like, you don't have to pay me. Just tell me when you're going to come up. We'll bring Emmett up and we'll work with him a little bit, because Emmett was going through, and I think Mel was having a hard time with this. Emmett played baseball for a year or two, and then all of a sudden he wasn't really interested in it.
Right.
And I think I was, fortunately, I didn't have that, to where, Steve obviously loved baseball, was good at it. I have to have another son, Daniel, who kind of liked playing, but he wasn't very good at it. But I had one that was, and that was okay, where, he had Emmett, and I think he really wanted Emmett to love baseball the way he loved baseball. And I think he wanted to go through that, enjoy watching Emmett play. And, unfortunately that, now that obviously is not going to happen. So I think that was a big void that was with Mel over the last 2 or 3 years, that Emmett really kind of wasn't playing baseball, because as we all talked about, I mean, Mel was an absolute giant in the game in that regard, knew everybody knew him. And it's just incredible. Now I'm realizing how much of a giant he was. When I worked with him 5 days a week, sat beside him, and we busted on each other for an hour and a half, as I've talked about. I didn't realize what kind of a giant he really was. But Joe and Eric are right, that if you needed information, hey, Mel, can you get me the information on this? Can you get me a stat for this? Or do you know anybody that might know something about different things? He was able to contact somebody and get winter ball stats from me that I couldn't find anywhere. And like 2 days later, he gives me, a couple pages where a guy had sent an email back and had all my winter ball statistics from Colombia, South America, Puerto Rico, Dominican, and all these different places. I'm like, he just knows everybody. And it was a lot of fun. And gosh, I'm just having a hard time really believing this is not going to happen anymore.
Rob and Alex, you guys hosted the show. What kind of comfort was it to have somebody with that kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the game, that if there was a pause or anything, you could throw him anything and he could handle it? Rob?
I kind of nicknamed him the truth sayer, because that's exactly what he was. I mean, I think you said it best. You could throw anything at Mel at any given time. He didn't have to look it up. He would, you knew he wasn't making it up, because after the show, I would dig further into it, not because I doubted him, but just because I was amazed that he would know it off the cuff. Like Dave said, I mean, he could find any information out at any given time, and he would tell stories. Mel we would bring up a player, and Mel would have some little known or unknown fact about the player. You're like, dude, I mean, how do you know when his dad told him when he was 11 years old, when he struck out in Little League Baseball? That was Mel. Mel would have some unknown piece of history of some player, some famous player. And you're like, how do you know that? And Dave and I sometimes will look at one another like, who is this guy? And Dave, if I could address this, we didn't know what kind of giant he was because he wouldn't let us. His humility, he was too humble to let you know. He would not remind you of what kind of giant he was. You'd have to find that out yourself because once again, he didn't take himself that serious. I don't know who said he was a steward of the game. That's what he considered himself. He wasn't big. The sport was bigger than him, and he was just a steward in his own mind. So that's why we didn't know how big he was.
Well,
Once again, that's Mel.
Just to jump in real quick and to get back to a point when and Joe and Eric and Rob, you mentioned it, and maybe even Alex said that Mel would get there. You know, we had a show at 5 o'clock. We were supposed to be there around 4. Rob, you got there about 5:05. And I got there right before you, but you never knew that. You thought I was there an hour before you, and you know, and Mel was there for an hour and a half, as he said, before he even said hi to anybody. And then, of course, he would sneak down and get a soda. I don't think he was allowed to have soda.
A bag of chips.
So he would get a soda and a bag of chips. And of course, once the donuts came in, you know, Rob bought the donuts, and it was so funny. The whole donut thing is just unbelievably hilarious because
it's a Seinfeld show.
Rob would bring the donuts and he'd sit them on Mel's desk. Because first of all, Rob didn't eat the donuts, but he brought them in mostly every Thursday or Friday. And he sit them on Mel's desk, which was kind of right in the middle of everybody's desk. So of course I was trying to lose weight at the time, but I'm not going to be able to get away from a donut. I'm having a donut. And I think for maybe a couple of weeks, I didn't grab the donuts. I had some willpower, and after that, it broke me. But so I'd have his and I mean my donut, and then I'd have the one that Rob didn't eat for himself, and I'd have a couple. But it was like people. We would go around and say, "Hey, you know, donuts on Mel's desk," and then people would come and they'd thank Mel, and Mel wouldn't say, "Well, I didn't bring them, Rob did," but he kind of was like. He didn't want to take credit for it, but he did not take credit for it. And the whole thing was that I think everybody kind of thought, for a long while anyway, that like whether Steve Barrett would come in or Paul or somebody would come in and get a donut, and they thought that Mel bought the donuts when Mel never bought donuts, I think, in his life.
One time.
I didn't know until
they came in a pizza box and we didn't know where they were from. It was super weird.
I didn't know until he passed away that he never bought the donut. I always thought he bought the donut. And I worked there for 18 months.
Rob bought the donuts, and
he would bust my chops about my bad selection of donuts first.
I've read that now. Yeah.
Well, when Rob started, you know, Rob got away from us. He started doing the pre and post game show all the time. So that's when Alex, we fortunately got somebody nice in there, and Alex came in. Oh, I'm sorry, Rob still. And so then I started going to Walmart and getting donuts. So I would bring donuts in because I was hooked at that point. Rob did it to me, and I'd have a couple, you know, 2 or 3 of my own, and I'd sit them there on, you know, make donuts are here, and everybody thought that Mel brought the donuts. And it was just. It was just one of those things. It was an inside joke. It was hilarious.
You know what's funny about that, though, is when I brought donuts about 3 or 4 times, Mel always acted like he was pissed at me for stealing his thing, and he never bought the donuts.
He wasn't acting. He wasn't acting. That was his thing.
Glenn, I know you got a couple more.
I like this. I really like this, guys, and I feel like when we lose somebody that we care about, telling stories is kind of what helps the most. So I do want to kind of leave an open floor for stories, just sort of silly things that folks would know. The donut thing is incredible, by the way. It's an incredible story. But Alex and Eric, just a story that means something to you about Mel that the average person that read his work or watched him on TV might not know.
It's not a silly thing, but it's a very Mel thing. And anybody out there that has been reading about Mel, and lots of folks, Dan Connolly and others have written wonderful pieces about what made Mel. But you know, a lot of folks talk about how he never really talked about him. He wanted to talk about you. And that was sort of the reporter and the very sort of human reporter in him. Well, one time there was like the fellows will remember this. A couple years ago, there was like a big staff meeting. Everybody from MASN had to be at the warehouse at a certain day, at a certain time. And we were all there for an hour or whatever. And then Mel said, hey, why don't we grab lunch? And we went to, just he and I went to Dempsey's. And we were talking, and I was all into, so Mel, did you ever interview Barry Bonds? Did you interview this guy? And he would quickly sort of pivot, and he would ask me, how's my sort of real estate business going? What does my wife do? How are my daughters? And no matter how much I want to talk to Mel about Mel, the reporter and the human being in Mel, and this sort of very selfless Mel, really was more interested in the boring Alex Parker life. And I just was sort of struck by it then. I've certainly been struck by it in reading about him, because everybody kind of says that Mel Antonen really cared about you. He cared about everybody else. And even though he was a big shot on any level, Keith Olbermann tweeted about Mel. Rob talked about the other tweets that came in from Mel. Everybody in this business beyond baseball has been tweeting about Mel and how much he meant to them, but he never thought of that. So I just was sort of struck by his selflessness, his lack of ego, which in this business is very hard to find. And frankly, it should be hard to find, but it's hard to find, but not for Mel. Mel was not about Mel. Mel was about baseball and his family and everybody else.
It's awesome. It's awesome. Guys, anybody else who wants to jump in with one? Eric, Joe, something we might not know.
One. So as Joe pointed out, the winter meetings, it's a grueling 3 days. So my first year going, Mel kind of showed me the ropes. So it's probably the beginning of the third day. And usually everybody there worn down, sick, whatever. So we had a big interview set up for 8 o'clock. Mel would always be in the workroom at 7 o'clock. Every day he was first, second, third person in there. Well, I get down there at 7:30. I'm a little worried. Mel's not there yet. So I'm calling him, texting him, still not answering. I'm like, uh-oh. So it's probably about 8 o'clock. Here comes Mel struggling up the hallway. And I'm looking at him like he doesn't feel good. So he sits down. He's like, I'm like, you all right, Mel? He's like, yeah, I just need a minute. So he continues, does the interview. We get it done. He's like, I'm gonna have to go back to the room. I'm like, what's wrong? He's like, well, I went out to dinner last night. And I was like, are you okay? He's like, yeah, but he's like, I should have known after the fourth piece of cake I had, I should have stopped.
Oh.
So his thing, and that's with the donuts thing. He was a big, he liked to eat
sweets,
you know, and he didn't eat them all the time. So when he could eat them, he just went. And so for that was my winter meeting story, where he overdid it on the chocolate cake, and for the next day he was no good. So
Rob, you got one?
Yeah.
Glenn, yeah, guys, I used to always open up the show. You know, the monologue was I would try to just make fun of those two guys. And when I knew when I got under Mel's skin, I knew when I got him, not in a negative way, but I knew when I got the best of him, because he would always scream out the same thing, and the same question, that was, when will this show ever end? I mean, that was Mel's thing. Or if I corrected him, it was always, he looked me straight at me like I was a smart. I like to say, my most humble apology.
My most humble apologies.
Yes, Mel had some, like, I think Dave said it best. I hope Dave wasn't talking about me. But he said Mel knew how to dish it as well as take it, because his sarcasm was classic. He has a dry humor that's so sarcastic that makes you check yourself. And just, again, he's hilarious, man. I mean, I don't mean it in a derogatory way. He's just a hilarious guy. And he's one of those guys that even now that he's gone, you can still hear his voice when you think of some of the things that he says. You can see his expression. He's one of those guys that just left a lasting impression on me personally.
Dave, how about you, Dave?
Well, I know Joe's got some story. I want to hear what Joe.
I have a few. Well, to go along with what Rob was saying about his humor, and how I know at the end of every show, I would go around the room and I'll say, great job, guys. Dave, great job. Alex, great job. Mel, we'll see you Monday. And look, it got old to me. I didn't want to say it, but Mel laughed every single time. And so I was going to keep saying it. And so he was just if he was going to laugh about it, and then he'd he'd dish it right back, and then he'd be like, all right, well, I'm getting out of here, so you guys can talk about me now. And so he'd pretend to leave out the door, and we all would start spitting stuff about Mel, and then he'd peek his head back in and just have that cackling laugh. It was hilarious. But I'll that's one of the things. And then the Happy New Year thing, where Dave and I would say Happy New Year. It was a joke from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Oh, it eventually became a joke from Curb. And so we didn't know exactly which day into the year that you could stop saying Happy New Year. And so we kept saying it, and Mel would be like, it's not funny anymore, guys. It's not. And so we kept doing it. And I didn't want to say Happy New Year until November the 2nd. But we did anyway because of Mel. But that humor is just something that we can always have and look back at and just laugh. And it's hitting hard, but we're remembering such an amazing person, and the humor is going to give us laughs for years. And it wasn't just the humor, like you guys said, that he was extremely humble about everything in his career that he did. With going to the winter meetings with him, meeting all these people, and he wanted to make sure that the people that he was interviewing, he said, he always would introduce me to these people, and that was always very, very big. He didn't have to do all that stuff. Yeah. He didn't have to do half of what he did, but going to, he was very big with his family, is what I kept hearing on social media and from everybody. And I remember when we went to Vegas for the winter meetings, I had found out the day before I flew out that I was going to be a father for the first time. And so I was really scared, and I was terrified. And so I'm like, my brain was just not there. And I just remember Mel and I went to go get a bite to eat during our break. And I had to let it out. So Mel was the first person I told that I was going to be a father. And he looks at me and he's like, that's fantastic. That's, oh my gosh, that's so great. And he kept bringing it up the next 3 days that we were there. How's your wife doing? How's he doing? So, and he just kept asking me about, fatherhood, and telling me his stories about this. And so I'll remember the gentle side of Mel, and how he was the first person I told this huge news. And I'm glad I did. But then he has that humor side too, which he was just the complete package. And he was quirky, and he was humble, and he was, like I said, just Mel. There's no other way to describe it.
Dave?
Yeah, I think that when I think of Mel, and we talked about, I have to bring up Tom Davis, because Tom, of course, hosted the show a long time in the beginning. And of course, we all know that Mel coughed. And then, of course, they installed it irritated Tom so much that they put and I guess the guys, Eric and Joe and the guys in the back, they would, Chris, they would hear it too. And so they got him a cough button, and he would forget to use it. And then the strangest thing was that I was sitting right beside him, and I wouldn't hear him cough, because when I'm talking, if he wasn't talking, then Tom was talking, or if Tom was talking, then I was talking. And as everybody knows, I was trying to talk more than everybody. And so I was talking a lot, and I wasn't hearing Mel cough. So I could see Tom just ready to explode. And we would go to break, and Tom would be like, Mel, use the cough button. Will you please use the cough button? And I'm going, I didn't hear him cough. And it's like, he must have coughed like 20 times, and I never heard him once. And it was absolutely drove Tom crazy. I don't know what it was doing to the guys in the control room, because we couldn't see them. But every now and then we get a little something in the ear, in the talk back. But it just drove Tom Davis absolutely bananas.
Hey guys.
He tossed him some cough drops between breaks.
Yeah.
Hey guys,
he would toss them one. Yep.
We really have it's been really therapeutic to talk about Mel in this way. I appreciate all of you coming on tonight. I read something in one of the columns about Mel. This is his words from his speech when he was inducted into South Dakota Amateur Baseball Hall of Fame. He said, "I love baseball because it always brings me home. A baseball park in my mind is a home. It doesn't matter if it's next to a cornfield in Lake Ortowan or if it's next to a bustling subway in New York City." That's Mel's love for the game of baseball. Guys, thank you very much for being part of this. Remembrance
Dan.
of Mel. See you soon. Okay?
Guys.
Let's stay in touch.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.